I remember it really clearly. It was about 20 years ago, back when we lived in Washington. My wife was never the outdoorsy type, so when my son Brandon wanted to go camping, it was always just me and him. That wasn't bad though, it was good father-son time. It was a nice scenic drive on the way to the campsite. I remember Brandon asked me about the music on the radio, and I spent an embarrassingly long time reminiscing about my high school days and what bands I was obsessed with back then. Eventually, we reached our site and I got to work pitching our tent. Brandon waited patiently. He wasn't the type to go running off or anything. And when it was all set up, me and him went for a hike to take in the nature. It was really peaceful. The woods surrounding the campground were calm and serene. There wasn't any animals out and about, but every once in a while I would stop and point out a deer track or some droppings. It reminded me of when I was a kid spending time with my dad. I suppose I was about 9 years old when I learned about the marvels of deer poop myself. As I looked at him, I couldn't help but see a younger version of myself. We had the same eyes, the same hair, and like most of the people in my family, we had the same birthmark on our upper right arm. It was hard spending time with Brandon sometimes. I worked so often, and sure, it was putting food on the table, but whenever I saw how fast he was growing without me around, the guilt would start to well up inside me. Seeing him smile and laugh that day really uplifted my spirits though. I was here now, and that's what mattered, is what I'd tell myself whenever the conversation lulled. As we were walking, we suddenly found the trail leading out of the woods and into a beautiful view of the river. I was telling Brandon about erosion and how you could see the effects of the previous year's floods on the riverbank when his expression suddenly changed. He pointed up to the sky and said, "What's that, Dad?" I looked up myself and found that I was just as confused as he was. There was, off in the distance, a dark, triangular-looking object. It hung in the sky perfectly still and then suddenly vanished. Not wanting to lose my reputation as a know-it-all dad, I desperately searched for an explanation before deciding that it must have been a helicopter and telling Brandon as such. He obviously didn't believe me, and frankly, I didn't believe myself either. By the time we got back to our tent, the sun had already started to set. I got Brandon to help me collect some firewood and start up a fire. We roasted some hot dogs and marshmallows. We didn't get to the scary stories, however, as Brandon started nodding off, and I decided it was time for bed. I got Brandon into his sleeping bag, and I crawled into mine right beside him. It was the shaking that woke me at first. I had been in an earthquake before, but this was different. It was hard to describe. It was almost like someone was picking up the earth, and the earth was trying to pull it back. I was still groggy. I reached out to see if Brandon was awake, and I found his sleeping bag empty. I wasn't too panicked yet. Like I said, he wasn't the type to run off, and I always try to keep a level head. I stumbled out of the tent and walked towards where the flashlights were, confident that I would find him near the fire trying to cope with the shaking. Then the lights happened. The whole campground was bathed in a bright, sickly, white light. It was blinding at first, and when my vision adjusted, I realized that Brandon was nowhere to be found. That was when I started to panic. I grabbed a flashlight and started shouting his name. As I ran to the edge of the woods surrounding the campsite, I tried looking for a source for the light, but I couldn't see one. As I ran to the edge of the woods, my pounding heart skipped a beat when I heard Brandon's voice. He called out to me, "Dad! I'm over here." I rushed over. My happiness quickly abated when he started crying, "Help! Something's wrong." I ran to the other side of the campsite and found him crouched away from me in a little ditch. The shaking had mostly subsided and I rushed over to him. He was facing away from the light, and I put my hand on his back. "What's the matter? Are you hurt?" I could hear him struggling for air. "Dad!" he finally cried. "Something's wrong. Everything's wrong." His voice was weak. I reached to his hand, and when I touched it, alarm bells rang in my head. His skin was rubbery and wrinkly, like a Halloween mask. I turned my flashlight on, and his whole skin looked a horrid purple. "Brandon!" I muttered in shock. I turned him to face me and screamed. His face was emaciated, his eyes so sunken they looked like a skull's empty sockets. His jaw hanged open, like the muscles that held it were worn and worthless. My whole body shook in terror. The shaking started back up again. this time even more violently. It seemed as if the ground was going to get ripped up and thrown into the sky. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed Brandon and held him as close to me as I could. I found myself praying to a God I was never sure actually existed. Through gurgles and moans, Brandon started to talk. "It hurts, Dad. Why does it hurt so much? Help me, Dad." As I squeezed him, I could feel him get thinner and thinner, like his insides were being sucked out. It felt like there was nothing left of him. Tears started rolling down my face, and the last thing I heard him say, faint as a whisper, haunted me. "Why won't you help me, Dad?" A nudge caused me to bolt up in my sleeping bag. Brandon was prodding me. "Wake up, Dad, I'm hungry." I got up, more than a little confused. As my heart stopped racing and I came back to reality, I realized that I had just had a crazy nightmare. I chuckled to myself. After Brandon was fed, I walked over to the ditch from the previous night. There was nothing weird or out of the ordinary. Brandon, too, seemed just like he always was and didn't mention anything about the previous night. When I walked back to Brandon and asked if he felt the ground shake, he said he hadn't felt a thing. When we got back to civilization, I asked other people the same thing, and they all agreed with Brandon. For a week then, my mind was at ease. I worked a lot again that week, and when I finally had a day off, me and the wife took Brandon to the pool. It was only there that memories of that night came flooding back and the horror with it. When Brandon took his shirt off, I looked at his arm and noticed the family birthmark was missing. Last night I came back from one of those mental health camping trips where all you bring, electronic-wise, is an emergency radio and a digital camera. Other than what I'm about to tell you, it was actually insanely good for my health. I was struggling with my job for a little bit, and let's be honest, I was also struggling with life in general, but was able to simply relax. It what felt like the first time in years, to be honest. I came back a new person, a fresh slate to write the rest of my life on. I later found out I came back a new person in a more literal way. The camping part went smoothly. I enjoyed some fishing, cooked with a campfire, met some other people on their own retreat as well. You know, the normal camping stuff. I also took lots of pictures. A week after I arrived, I packed up all of my things and went back to my truck, ready to go back to my home. The ride back went smoothly, but I do have to admit that first night of sleeping in my own bed rather than a cot felt so fucking good. I woke up this morning and decided to go through my photos before heading into work, to see what I wanted to download to my computer and what I wanted to trash. This is where things get odd. The first picture was of me with a group of about 6 other people. I don't remember a single one of these guys. All of their faces were blurred out, like they turned their heads swiftly right as the picture was being taken of them. We all had our hands around each other, and the girl next to me was getting really close and personal with my waist. But I don't remember a single one of them. This catches me off guard. I just know I went camping alone, but from the looks of these pictures, I can see my tent in the background, with a couple other tents placed there too, all in perfect condition. It felt like I was staring at an alternate reality, like what could have been if I went with a group. Eventually I shrug it off as maybe drinking a little too much one night and forgetting about a group of wanderers that just set up with me for the night. You know, a lousy excuse that made me feel less insane. Eventually I scroll through the rest of the pics. Some of them are things I remembered, like fishing and cooking, but they always had other people in it, as if they were removed by my memories. And like always, their faces were blurred. Now I go to the second day's worth of pictures. At the start of the day, there seems to be the same picture as before, except the guy all the way to the left wasn't in the picture anymore, just simply gone. Again, the same process continues. The rest of the pictures that day are the ones I remember, but simply with more people added into the mix that I don't. I look at the next day, and another person disappears. The next day, another one disappears. And then another goes, continuing the process until there is just me and this woman left, her arms around my waist, hugging me with a blurred face. I noticed that all of the tents were still there, but tattered as if they just got out of a storm. Except mine, which was perfect. Now I am beyond freaking out, trying to make sense of what happened. Who were they? Where did they go? What is happening? Why don't I remember? I looked down at my watch and noticed that I have been pondering over these photos for way too long and was a couple hours late for work. I shoved the camera into my bag, and since I was already dressed, I ran to the car. I get into the office about half an hour later, walking in disheveled. I got a few looks from some of my employees, but shrugged them off heading to my office. One of them walks up to me to ask me something I don't think I'll ever forget. "Where is your wife?" "My wife?" "Yeah, her and the rest of management. You guys all went on a retreat, and you're the first one to come back." I look at my desk and notice a picture with all 7 of us from the original photo. I quickly open up my camera and go back to the first photo, matching the bodies up with each other to confirm their identities. Sure enough, they were the management that I worked with, but I still did not remember a single one of them. I scroll to the last photo I have taken and see me. Only me and 6 blurred bodies hanging, suspended from trees behind me, with their heads all forcefully bent in a 90-degree angle. I noticed that my hands were both well within view of the picture as my blood went cold. Who was taking all of the pictures?